Good morning, everyone, from me. Thank you, Father Dominic, for a marvellous introduction to the day. I think you've set out perfectly what the day is all about and how it came together. So I'm especially delighted, personally, to introduce our first speaker of the day, Professor Alice Ramos. I first met Alice in 2017 in New Orleans, American Maritain Association annual meeting. Alice is Professor Emerita of Philosophy at St. John's University in Queens, New York, where she has taught since 1987. She holds a PhD in philosophy from the University of Navarra in Spain and a PhD in French literature from New York University. Her publications include Beauty and the Good, covering the classical tradition from Plato to Duns Scotus, Dynamic Transcendentals, Truth, Goodness and Beauty from a Thomistic perspective, 2 edited books for the American Maritain Association, a book written in Spanish, the title of which I won't try to pronounce, and over 60 articles. Alice is a past president of the American Maritain Association and has been a member of the Executive Council of the American Catholic Philosophical Association. She has also served on the Executive Committee of the Metaphysical Society of America. She has for a number of years collaborated in research projects in medieval philosophy with colleagues from the University of Navarra and other European and Latin American universities. So we're thrilled that you're here to join us today. We look forward to what you are bringing us. Professor Ramos.
Well, thank you very much, Chris, and thank you to Father Dominic White also, and to everyone related to this day. I have prepared a handout. I think most of it is clear, except that there is one part, which is the third part, that has to do with creative intuition. And if anyone has read Maritain's creative intuition work, they know that it's rather dense. So I've tried to summarize some of that in about 30 pages, whereas Maritain has written about 200 pages. So I think my presentation will take about 35 or 40 minutes, leaving some time for questions and answers. I'll begin. In an essay entitled Maritain and Poetic Knowledge, the 20th century Thomist and Maritainian scholar Ralph McInerney notes that many things influence how an artist or anyone sees the world. Maritain says that besides the psychological, genetic, and other accidental components of an artist's vision, there also seems to be room in it for an influence from his moral character. For those familiar with the writings of Jacques Maritain, it appears that he did in fact think that an artist's moral character could influence his art, although what he says is certainly not conclusive. According to Maritain, and I quote, according to McInerney, and I quote, Maritain's position remained tantalizingly vague. That may be one of its attractions. Who will dare to carry on the line of investigation Maritain opened up, end of quote. While I am not in the habit of daring, I do consider Maritain's position attractive and want to explore its importance for the arts, an importance which I think can be applied to almost any professional occupation, but which is of particular relevance to the arts, given the outstanding mission that Maritain accorded to art. For him, art is the most natural power of healing and agent of spiritualization needed by the human community. Besides, given the Catholic Church's recent recognition of the heroic virtues of Antonio Gaudí, the architect of the Sagrada Familia Basilica in Barcelona, the topic of this paper seems timely. I want to begin by saying that while Maritain has been labeled a neo-Thomist, some do not think that he is Thomistic enough, although he certainly deploys a thought of Thomas in ways that shed new light on art and on the human person's creativity. Besides, Aquinas did not write extensively about human art, never having written a treatise on art as we find in Aristotle's Poetics. nor did Aquinas write a treatise on beauty, although there is in his corpus an abundance of scattered remarks on beauty, both in the natural and supernatural realms. Remarks that warrant attention and that have already been the object of study by philosophers and theologians alike. Despite the absence of any treatise on art and beauty in Aquinas, I do think that Maritain leans heavily on the angelic doctor. In order, for example, to distinguish between art and prudence, calling these two independent worlds, and yet recognizing the influence of morality on art, albeit an indirect influence. I shall then begin my paper with a consideration of this distinction, the distinction between art and prudence, and will proceed to the Thomistic notion of knowledge by connaturality, which Aquinas applies principally to the realm of morality, and which he sees primarily as a sort of experiential knowledge in the moral or virtuous person, a spontaneous sort of knowledge, whereby the person who has cultivated virtue sees and knows how to act, without having to go through a reasoning process, because the virtue has become second nature to the person. This type of knowledge is also called affective knowledge. According to Maritain, knowledge by connaturality has fallen into oblivion and needs to be restored, and moreover extended to the domain of art and poetry. It seems to me that this sort of knowledge is conditioned by the degree to which the artist takes a disinterested stance with respect to his own ego. If he does not, then the work of art is in jeopardy, as is also the beauty to which art tends. Let me begin with the Thomistic distinction between art and prudence, or art and morality, which Maritain makes his own and which appears in a number of his works. Art is a virtue of the practical intellect, which pursues the good or perfection of the work, that is, of the thing made. The artist, as artist, is only responsible to his work. According to Aquinas, art as a virtue is right reason about works to be made. The good of the things made does not depend on the condition of the appetite of the artist, for at stake is not the artist's own good, but rather the good of the work made. An artist is therefore commended not for the condition of his will, which is his rational appetite, but rather for the quality of his work, which is good. But while art is a virtue concerned with making, it has something in common with speculative virtues, since these, like art, are concerned with the quality of their object, and not with how the human appetite may be affected toward an object. Aquinas points to the mathematician, whose appetitive faculty may be affected by joy or anger, but this does not matter as long as he demonstrates the truth. The mathematical argument's truth is not therefore assessed according to the moral character of the mathematician. In like manner, for Aquinas, the appetitive condition of the artist does not matter either. Art and the virtues of the speculative intellect are thus the capacities or powers to work well, such as to produce a good artwork, one that is well made, or to arrive at truth by means of mathematical argumentation. The good use of these capacities is not, however, ensured by art or by the speculative virtues. From the Thomistic tradition in which Maritain writes, the artist's capacity to produce good artworks is independent of his moral condition. Art does not intrinsically depend on moral virtue, just as the mathematician's argument does not depend on his moral character. In fact, from what Aquinas says, the person who is learned in moral science can correctly judge acts of virtue, even if he himself does not possess the virtue. However, in order to use the virtue of art well, the artist also needs moral virtues which will perfect his appetites. Aquinas holds that since art does not make its possessor use the capacity well, then art falls short of being a perfect virtue. For according to Aristotle, a virtue will generally cause its possessor to perform his function well and make him a good man. In order then to become a good man and lead a good life, The artist who possesses the capacity to produce good artifacts will also need that his appetites, and especially his will, be perfected by moral virtues, if he is to make good use of the virtue of art. It is not surprising then that Aquinas should appeal to Aristotle, who says that there is a virtue of art that is a moral virtue requisite for the good use of art. It is the virtue of justice, which rectifies the artist's will to do his work faithfully. I will return to this virtue later in my paper. Now, prudence, too, is a virtue of the practical intellect, concerned with the good of man, with the perfection of his choices, which will lead to his becoming a morally good man. There is, in the case of prudence, an intrinsic dependence on the person's appetites being directed to the true good. Without rectification of the appetites, since art merely confers the capacity or aptness for a good work, prudence does indeed presuppose the rectitude of the appetites, since prudence confers both the aptness for a good work and the use. Therefore, the possession of prudence, together with the other moral virtues, would enable the man who is an artist to use well the art that he has, and to become then not only a good artist, but also a good man. Since art regards the sphere of making, prudence concerns the sphere of action, Maritain situates art outside the line of human conduct, because art has its own end, rules, and values, which regard not those of the man, the work to be produced. Art becomes all-absorbing for the artist, and the artist seems to live in a world apart, where he and his art are solely at the service of the thing which is being made. Maritain does, however, recognize that there is a distinction between the end pursued by the art and the method of the art. If art is not human in the end which it pursues, which is the good of the work, it is essentially human in its method of working. It involves the making of a man's work, stamped with the character of a man, that is, a rational animal. What Maritain means by this is that the work of art, although instantiated in something material, has been formed in and directed by the mind. The reality of the art is thus dependent on this formal element. For Maritain, the work to be done is merely the matter of art. The form of it is undeviating reason. The expression of undeviating reason reminds us of Aquinas' own definition of art as right reason in regard to the making of things. While from the point of view of art, the artist is concerned only with the good of the work and not with the good of man, it is reasonable to think that from the point of view of morality, what the artist writes, paints, or composes does matter. For before being an artist, he is a man, and he is thus responsible for the good of human life, both in himself and in his fellow men. Maritain thinks that, considered in themselves, art and morality are two autonomous worlds, each supreme within its own domain. However, because human life needs beauty and intellectual creativity, and because the artist exercises his art in the midst of human life, art and morality cannot ignore one another, for the artist who is a man belongs to both these worlds. The artist is both an intellectual maker and a moral agent engaged in actions which affect others in the human community and which will affect his own personal destiny. Maritain thus affords a superiority to the world of morality over the world of art, because the destiny of man depends on no law other than that of morality, although he qualifies this superiority by claiming that art is extrinsically and indirectly subordinate to morality. In distinguishing between the virtue of art and the soul of the artist, who is first and foremost a man, Maritain adds that art as a virtue is instrumentally subordinate to the soul that acts by means of it, and that the soul of the artist, with all its loves and all its human, moral, and religious intentions, intentions which are outside of the artistic order, and which the soul may pursue, is the principal cause that uses the virtue of art as an instrument. When the soul of the man in the artist is diminished, so too is diminished the virtue of art which belongs to the artist as a working man. The subordination of art to the soul is reiterated by Maritain when he says more emphatically that by the subject or the man in whom art exists, art is subordinate, even if extrinsically subordinate to the good of the human subject. When an artist uses his free will to execute a work of art, he enters not only the sphere of artistic standards, but also the sphere of moral standards, where the good of human life is primary. If we consider, however, the distinction between the formal object of art, which I take to be the intellectual form imposed on the matter, which form radiates beauty, and which is the aim directly intended by art, and makes art be what it is, then the formal object of art is not in itself, according to Maritain, subordinate to the formal object of morality. Maritain adds, however, that not only must formal causality be taken into consideration, but also material causality. Morality has a connection with the virtue of art in what Maritain calls the order of material or dispositive causality, a connection which is extrinsic and indirect, but nevertheless inevitable and real. In other words, insofar as art exists in man, ethical realities will concern the artist as a man and will have an impact on the artist as an artist. This connection between morality and art is evident when we consider that even the highest moral virtues will not make up for the mediocrity or the lack of the virtue of art in an artist, and that there are, in addition, moral vices, such as laziness and cowardice, which do not provide a suitable environment for the exercise of artistic activity. The artist's moral constitution thus has a kind of indirect impact on his art. As Maritain sees it, the deficiency or even the particular beauty of an art's work may well be the result of a lack of psychological and moral integration, and what he calls the split between sensibility and the creative faculty of the intellect or the imagination. Maritain graphically puts this lack of integration of the artist's sensible and intellectual powers in the following way, I quote, "A moral poison which warps in the long run the power of vision will finally, through an indirect repercussion, warp artistic creativity, though perhaps this poison will have stimulated or sensitized it for a time," end of quote. For Maritain, the work always avows, such that even in the case of great artists whose work is exceptional, there can be said to be a soft spot in that greatness, for the work is nourished by the experience of the artist as man. From what Maritain says about the artist's vision or his knowledge being affected by moral poison, and thus in turn affecting the work of art, it would seem that he is returning us here to the importance of the morally good use of the virtue of art, which, while being extrinsic to the art as such, nevertheless places art in its exercise in the wider human moral context. Maritain also makes reference to the inner inclinations of the artist, which may be termed his affections or loves, as these serve to fix the artist's attention on certain things and thus reveal things to him. For Maritain, it is through the artist's emotion and subjectivity that the artist, insofar as his creative intuition is concerned, knows all that he knows. The soul of an artist that is darkened by immorality will not be able to see things as they really are. To highlight this connection, Maritain quotes from the Neoplatonist philosopher Plotinus, who says, "Just as one can say nothing about the beauties of senses if one has no eyes to perceive them, so it is with the things of the spirit if one cannot see how beautiful is the face of justice or temperance." End of quote. It seems right to say that the darkness of immorality impedes the vision of the real and the beautiful. And yet Maritain also recognized that there were great artists who lived immoral lives. He seems, however, attracted by the idea that a morally good person, provided that other factors remain the same, will be the better artist. At the same time, Maritain does admit that moral or religious conversion does not necessarily make the work of an artist better, especially where minor artists are concerned. Lofty moral ideas or religious feelings may come to occupy the artist's mind, and he may be tempted to express them in his art, such that they may be detrimental to his art because they become all too easily, as Maritain says, substitutes for deep experience and creative intuition. If, however, the artist is possessed of a great and strong virtue of art, his moral and or religious conversion will require of him that he be even more exacting in his art, and that he allow time and patience to mature and deepen his new experience and inspiration. Maritain cites examples of artists whose work was in no way hindered by their faith in their conversion to God. Artists such as Hopkins, Claudel, Bernanos, Mauriac, and others. If morality and religion are to play a significant role in the artist and in his work, then it seems that the artist must have as his end not only the good of his work or its beauty, but also the good of himself as man. While the sole end of the virtue of art is the work itself and its beauty, the artist as man is directed to the ultimate good of human life. As Maritain puts it, and I quote, "Because art is in man, and because its good is not the good of man, art is subject in its exercise to a control from without, imposed in the name of a higher end, the very beatitude of the living creature in whom it resides." End quote. Let's assume then, as I think Maritain does, that a morally good person and a Christian, and he does say Christian, who possesses a robust virtue of art, will in fact be a better artist than his counterparts, for whom art is excessively divorced from morality and the good of human life. In order to reach the attitude, the higher end to which all men tend consciously or unconsciously, the man who is an artist, engaged, for example, in writing a poem, painting a landscape, or composing a symphony, must be performing acts that are proportionate to his final end. And if we take beatitude to mean, as I think St. Thomas does, and with which Maritain agrees, gazing on the beauty of God, then the beauty to which art tends, and the beauty which is affected in works of art, will be a trace of divine beauty, and so proportionate to the final end which the artist as a man seeks. What I say here can, I think, be better explained by turning now to Maritain's development of creative intuition in terms of knowledge by affective naturality, which regards, as we shall see, the inner universe of the artist's self, a self that, according to Maritain, can either be disinterested or egotistical. This is the third part. Creative or poetic intuition for Maritain is to be distinguished from two extreme positions, which are on the one hand, surrealism, whose founder defines poetry as the absence of any control exercised by reason, and in which there is a total unleashing of the powers of the unconscious and of the imagination, separated from the intellect. Maritain is here talking about poetry, but this can be applied to other arts as well. Surrealist poetry tends toward the ideal limit, termed automatic writing, where the automatic life of the unconscious is deaf to the intellect, as this is an unconscious of flesh and blood, instincts, tendencies, repressed images, and desires. On the other hand, the other extreme position is the Platonic concept of the muse, which is bound to madness, enthusiasm, and unconsciousness, and which abolishes logical thought. In addition to the beauty and delight that poems put us in contact with, Both the poets and their listeners in Plato will depend on an inspiration which is superior to reason. Because of the transcendence of beauty, which subsists in a world of separate ideas in the eternal fatherland, and because poetry's end for Plato is beauty, then the poet, through a sort of divine madness or inspiration given to him by God, comes in contact with the transcendent, a glimmer of which is instantiated in his poetry when he produces his work. The poem will thus be a mere shadow of transcendent beauty. As Maritain contrasts Platonic and surrealist notions of poetry, what becomes evident is that the source of poetry or poetic inspiration is separated from reason. Since for Plato, inspiration emerges from a source above reason, whereas for surrealism, creative intuition is assigned to a sensuous unconscious, and thus to a realm below reason. In both cases, the poets belong to the realm of what might be called unreason. For Maritain, on the contrary, there is a way to solve the debate of reason and poetry, since for him, poetry and the intellect are closely related and call out, as it were, to one another. The making of poetry requires technical or artistic reason, but for its foundation, poetry, the arts, require intuitive reason. According to Maritain, creative or poetic intuition is neither above nor below reason, but rather inspiration from above conceptual reason. It is in the soul of man, united with the intellect and the imagination, where creative intuition is found. It is therefore spiritual in origin and not extrinsic to the poet, as in the Platonic inspiration of the muse, nor a kind of Freudian unconscious, as in the surrealist deaf unconscious. Maritain recognizes the existence of a spiritual unconscious, which he also calls a musical unconscious, and which involves all the sensitive powers of the soul, especially the imagination and the emotions, insofar as these participate in the pre-conscious life of the intellect and the will. In order to explain the role which the intellect plays in creative intuition, Maritain points out that rational discourse and rational deliberation are preceded by the hidden workings of a deep and primal pre-conscious life, which develops, as he says, in a fertile and translucent night, and which resembles the light first created by God. Beneath reason's activity with its concepts and judgments and the will's resolutions are found the sources of creativity, knowledge, and of love, hidden, as Maritain says, in the primordial translucent night of the intimate vitality of the soul. An unconscious realm exists, which belongs to the spiritual powers of the soul, with its desire for knowing and seeing, for intellectual grasping and expressing, and for freedom, and which Maritain calls a spiritual or musical unconscious, unlike the surrealist automatic or deaf unconscious. These two kinds of unconscious life, that is, the spiritual unconscious versus the automatic or deaf unconscious, are in communication and also interfere with one another. For as Maritain writes, and I quote, "When man seeking for his own inner universe takes the wrong road, he enters the internal world of the deaf unconscious, while believing he enters the internal world of the spirit, and he thus finds himself wandering in a false kind of self-interiority, where wildness and automatism mimic freedom," end quote. The inner universe of the self is characteristic of the surrealist adventure, and for Maritain is the result of man's freakish egotism, the result of looking solely to the self and ignoring the contemplation of the external world. In order to explain the role of the intellect in creative intuition, Maritain enters into a discussion of the agent intellect. And I'll only say a few things about the agent intellect, but this is quite dense. He also calls this agent intellect the illuminating intellect, which permeates images originating in sensation. With its illuminating light, the agent intellect actualizes the potential intelligibility in those images, which are then freed from any material conditions. Maritain terms what is actuated by the agent intellect a spiritual germ, or seed, we might call it, or more technically into mystic terminology, the impressed species. Actual knowing only happens when the agent intellect stamps, as it were, the impressed species on the receptive or passive intellect, which in turn produces a more fully determined spiritual form, also called the express species. While this latter form can be consciously known when the intellect turns back on itself, neither the illuminating intellect nor the impressed species, or the spiritual germ, as Maritain calls it, are consciously known to us, since the process of illuminating images takes place in the unconscious. Without this process of illumination, however, there would be no formation of ideas or concepts, or what Aquinas calls expressed species. Now, in the case of poetic intuition, emotion plays an important role in the spiritual unconscious. Emotion is an analog of the impressed species, as the art to be produced is an analog of the expressed species. Like the sense image that has been illuminated, so too the emotion is spiritualized and made intentional, according to Maritain, conveying things other than itself in an immaterial way. Intentional or spiritual emotion becomes for the intellect the vehicle through which things which have impressed this emotion on the soul are known, even if only obscurely. It is by means of such a spiritualized emotion that poetic intuition, which in itself is an intellective flash, is born in the unconscious of the spirit. The intentional emotion conveys both the reality of the things of the world and the subjectivity of the poet. More specifically, the thing grasped by poetic intuition, that singular existent thing, is grasped through its affective resonance in the subjectivity of the artist. It is then not toward essences or concepts that poetic intuition is directed, but rather toward a particular existent thing that is connatural to the artist's soul, affected by a given emotion. While the focus is on a particular existent thing or being, and not on the universal or concept, poetic intuition is indeed cognitive, because it goes infinitely beyond that singular existent thing. Poetic intuition has no conceptualized object. It tends and extends to the infinite. It tends toward all reality, the infinite reality which is engaged in any singular existent thing, and which this singular existent thing conveys to the mind by the very fact that it's grasped through its union with and resonance in subjectivity spiritually awakened. As explained by Maritain, poetic intuition is connatural and truly human, involving the whole person with all its powers working together. That is, the intellect, the imagination, emotion, and the will. Not only is knowledge of a singular existent thing given, but also knowledge of all those other things that echo, as it were, in that existent thing, and also knowledge of the subjectivity of the artist, all of which is conveyed through the intentional spiritualized emotion. Things that are grasped by poetic knowledge are replete with meaning, surpassing themselves, as it were, and giving more than they have. For as Maritain sees it, they are permeated by the activating influx of the primal cause. The knowledge that is given in poetic intuition is only fully expressed in the work, both knowledge of things grasped through affective resonance in the subjectivity of the artist, and the awakening of the artist to his very self. Since poetic intuition is not only cognitive, but also creative, it is turned toward operation or the work. As soon as poetic intuition exists, deep within the non-conceptual life of the intellect, awakening the artist to himself and to the resounding secret of reality, the artist is motivated to create. For Maritain, everything is given in poetic intuition, which is born of significant spiritualized emotion, such that the whole work is present in advance. Whether this totality is virtually given, as in the first line of a poem, as a gift from the preconscious life of the soul, or virtually concentrated in the spiritual germ or seed of a novel or drama. Poetic intuition needs to be guarded and protected. The artist needs to prepare himself for it by removing obstacles and noise so that the power and transparency of poetic intuition spontaneously progress within him. The artist's poetic intuition will have creative strength in proportion to the depth of his attentiveness to the things of this world and to his own soul. He needs to plumb, as it were, the depths of the things and of his subjectivity, which has been awakened in him through intentional or spiritualized emotion. As Maritain sees it, poetic intuition demands that the artist listen to it and thus requires a serious school in discipline and in sacrifice. Moreover, the actual exercise of poetic intuition can be improved by humility and by the work of the artist's intelligence and his virtue of art, which deals with the ways in which the original insight or the original intuition is executed and perfected throughout the artistic process. According to Maritain, and I quote, "It is with the steady labor of intelligence, intent on the elaboration of a form, that the virtuality contained in poetic intuition actualizes and unfolds itself all along the process of production." And then, according to Maritain, the very exercise of artistic science and intellectual perspicacity, choosing, judging, cutting out all the non-significant, the superfluous, causes then new partial flashes of poetic intuition to be released at each step of the work. Because the intelligence in its labor is always listening to creative emotion and appealing to it. Without this steady labor, poetic intuition would not, as a rule, disclose its entire power. The fourth section now. Let me turn now to the distinction that Maritain makes between the creative self and the self-centered ego. This distinction is connected to the metaphysical difference between the human person as person and the human person as individual, or the distinction between individuality and personality. Matter, which is at the root of individuality, desires being, but also limits being, whereas personality is rooted in spirit and signifies interiority to oneself, requiring communication with others through knowledge and love. According to Maritain, the creative self of the artist views the person as person who is engaged in spiritual communication, and not the person considered as a material individual, centered on its own ego and grasping for itself. As we saw previously, egotism does not lead the artist into the inner universe of the spiritual unconscious, from which emerges authentic poetic intuition, but leads rather to the internal world of the automatic or deaf unconscious. Furthermore, for Maritain, egotism is the enemy of artistic activity. In the process of creation, the artist should be disinterested in his ego. His soul has spiritual powers that are characterized by expansiveness and generosity, and his passions and ambitions are not those of an egotist. As Maritain says, I quote, "Such internal abundance and magnanimity is the normal and connatural climate of the virtue of art. Narrowness and avarice in human desires make it live in cold and sleet." The artist is thus called to offer, as it were, his very self in sacrifice for his work. Only in this way will artistic activity be truly disinterested. Otherwise, when egotism enters the realm of the poetic act, then the artist offers himself in sacrifice to the world, to human glory, to money or power. Then the artist's virtue of art in its use will tend neither to the good of the work nor to the good of man. For what the artist is seeking are extrinsic goods, such as his own glory. I take this to be especially relevant in light of that virtue of art, which Aristotle posits as requisite for the good use of art, namely the virtue of justice, which rectifies the rational appetite that is the will. Whoever looks only at himself, as the egotist does, will not be able to see the truth of real things, and so he will neither be just nor prudent, for we cannot do the good unless we know reality. Finally, if the artist, both as artist and as man, seeks beatitude, which is his final end as man, and if this beatitude consists in the contemplation of the beauty of truth, then each artistic creation should be a reflection of that beauty, and thus an act proportionate to the artist's final end. The artist as artist and as man will ultimately need to ask himself where he has placed his loves, in himself and in extrinsic goods, or in his work as a means to engender in beauty, sacrificing himself for his work and seeing in his work a way to glorify God. As the poet Yeats puts it in The Choice, I quote, "The intellect of man is forced to choose perfection of the life or of the work. And if the second, must refuse a heavenly mansion raging in the dark." End of quote. It is possible that the perfection of the artist's life as a man and the perfection of his work not be at odds with each other. Whereas Maritain seems to think, the artist who has undergone a moral and religious conversion will be a better man, and his artwork will also be better. For he will know, as Francois Mauriac advised, that he will need to purify the source, that is, purify his very self, and thus work in a disinterested way, engaging his freedom in the expression of beauty in his work and in his life, seeking to glorify and please God and himself. Thank you.